Folks. Good afternoon, happy Pride, and welcome to the 2022 gsehd Pride Forum, the first of two treats this month for you, but we will start with the sweetest, if not the best. I will not put any dispersion on our next week event because we've got a great one, but today we have really good discussion for you. For those of you that may not know, my name is Dwayne Wright. I have the privilege and honor and indeed the pride to serve as an assistant professor of higher education administration, as well as the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives here at the Graduate School for Education and Human Development, which of course, hopefully you know, is part of the George Washington University. On June 28th, 1969, a group of participants were at a bar, a dive bar, a club, if you will, in Lower Manhattan, now known as the Lower East Side, colloquially known as the Village. This particular bar is known now in history as the Stonewall Inn, operated by what is colloquially called, I guess, the mafia, because the participants at this bar, this dive bar, this club, were there to drink, to have a good time, but by their very existence were breaking the law. You see, Stonewall at the time in 1969 was known to be a place that members of the LGBT community would go to hang out. And the police knew this, and unfortunately the laws at the time prohibited this type of gathering. It was enough was enough. Stonewall in 1969 on June 28th is best known as, quite frankly, a riot. It's known as a protest, and it lasted until July 3rd, when participants had decided that they have been oppressed, they had been marginalized, they had been restricted, quite frankly, enough. And this is known to history as the beginning of the LGBTQ movement in the United States of America. After Stonewall in 1969, the following June in 1970, several major cities, including Chicago, New York, LA, not quite DC yet, but we would get there, decided to have pride parades as a commemoration of Stonewall, in commemoration of the group that sacrificed many of their lives to get us to this point, but most importantly, to remember the protest, remember the sort of struggle that had started at the Stonewall Inn and the Stonewall riots at that time. Ever since that time, June has been the month that's been celebrated as so-called Pride Month. It started as a riot, it produced a protest, and it has moved to a celebration of the LGBT community here in DC, here in America, and around the globe. Here at gsehd, as part of our commemoration, quite frankly, part of our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion for all people, regardless of sexual orientation, religion, race, economic status, et cetera, we celebrate every June our annual Pride Forum. And I have the honor and privilege of welcoming you to that Pride Forum on behalf of our leadership, our Dean, Michael Foyer, our Associate Interim Dean, Lionel Howard, and all the faculty here at gsehd, but most importantly, our faculty, students, and staff that are LGBTQ Americans. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope that we do have a good one for you. In our first Pride Forum, we have an event that we're entitling Doing DEI with Pride. And we have three illustrious guests that I will turn it over to in a second. I will remind the group that's here with us, we're recording, and if you do want access to recording, maybe you have a friend that just couldn't make it, couldn't get out that lunch meeting, please let us know. Next week will be our second part of our 2022 Pride Forum, which will feature a conversation with the Deputy Chancellor of DC Public Schools, Dr. Kim. But for now, let's get started. In the tradition of queer culture and, LGBT, I've been rewatching Pose, which is a show on Fox that talks about ballroom culture. And I know that we in this community tend to like to express and introduce ourselves. So rather than introducing our illustrious guests, I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourself. Chris, we'll start with you since you're an alumni of our program, and we are so proud of everything that you will and have accomplished. AJ will then go with you. Eunice will then go with you. But why don't you just tell us about yourselves? You know, who are you? What do you do? Most importantly, how did you get there? You know, what was your journey through pride, through struggle to get to the position you're in as a DEI practitioner? And then once we get introductions done, we'll get into the meat and potatoes of the story. All right, folks, please feel free to use the chat function. The chat function is here and available, both the questions to the panelists, and if you just want to share, of course, you know, as is a typical practice here at GSHED, if you want to send a direct message to myself, you want to send a direct message to Meg Holland, that is a way to ask your question or produce your comment without necessarily having to identify yourself. The panelists, if they wish, can take direct messages if you want. Right around about 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, if you can stay around, we're going to turn it over to you. So please feel free to put your questions within the chat throughout, or you can save them and send them to me or put them in the chat at 1 p.m. right around that time when we go to the audience Q&A. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our illustrious guests. Chris, we'll start with you. Maybe name, pronouns, who are you, what do you do, and how did you get there? Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. I'm going to try to remember all the things that you just mentioned. So my name is Chris Hooten. My pronouns are they, them, EA. And I am a dark-skinned person with a shaved head who's wearing a purple and yellow and white caftan across a white-ish background. So in terms of who I am, I like to start from where I've come from and whose lineage I belong to. I am a descendant of African enslaved people in the Americas. I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community. I am what is now referred to as, and it could change, as non-binary. I also identify as a member of the trans community. I am asexual, and I am also a member of the neurodiverse community. At certain points in my life, I've also identified as working class, experiencing housing and also food insecurity. I'm trying to think, I came to this work as a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion, sort of how a lot of people came to this work, which is essentially after George Floyd was murdered, some say lynched, depending on your phrasing. I was sort of asked politely to be the new DEI person, and I said yes, right? Realizing that I was already doing this work. It just wasn't called DEI, right? And so I think a lot of us have been doing that work. While I was studying at GSHED with my master's in higher education under Ashley Stone, Dr. Stone, Wright, and others, my capstone project really encapsulated the experiences of historically marginalized groups. What were their stories? What were their experiences like navigating these institutions of higher learning? You know, where were there some disparities and what were behind those disparate outcomes? And how could you center those voices and center their experiences? And so that really excited me. I was especially really excited about Dr. Wright's class in talking about how to live by the values of diversity and inclusion within educational institutions. It was my hardest class in grad school. It was the only class I did. I got an A and I think I got an A minus, but you know, I'll try not to hold it against you, Dr. Wright. But it was the most challenging class. And I knew that that was my calling because I was the most challenging, and I was excited about it. I love doing the memos where institutions found themselves in a little bit of a pickle, and they had to come up with an idea to sort of challenge that or sort of reverse course. And so I like to think of myself as a director of community values and engagement, right? Because I find that DEI sort of elicits people, a corporate entity in their mind, something like a Pepsi or Nike making a statement. And I'm trying to reorient my institution right now into thinking about all of our work as practicing our values. Okay? So I've spoken enough, so I will let my fellow panelists covered.
No, thank you, Chris. And I must say you were an excellent student, and the A- was well earned, well earned, well earned. AJ, Eunice, who wants to go next?
Eunice, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Eunice. I also go by Eunz. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the Assistant Director for Cultural Programming and Social Justice Education with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement here at GW. And one of the questions was, how did you get here? So I'm here because of love. I'm here because I had folks during my time as an undergraduate student, but also throughout my master's, my time pursuing my master's, who really poured a lot of love and care into me. And it was also a time when I really found myself feeling grounded in cultural organizing and student organizing. And through that, I was able to find the language and tools to be able to not only understand the ways that my identity impacts others and how I process through my identity, but also how I relate to other people, and to really realize how interconnected we all truly are. And so this position came. It's an inaugural position, and found it really aligning with a lot of my values and the work that I want to be devoted to over the course of my career, which is being able to build opportunity spaces for folks to be able to work towards our collective liberation, to be able to learn from and challenge one another. So yeah, I am here because of love and people and community who have poured so much into me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Eunice. And I must say that, GW is so pleased and honored to have you. And we can't wait for the wonderful work that you'll do for our community and for our students. Thank you for joining us. Can't wait to work with you. AJ, last but certainly not least, why don't you wrap us up? Who are you and how'd you get to where you are right now?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Pleasure to meet you all. My name is AJ King. I am the Assistant Director of the Multicultural Student Service Center and LGBTQ Resource Center. He, him, his pronouns. How I got into this field, well, it started off with me just having a lived experience, right? So as someone who is a gay man of color, I have always dealt with this experience of intersectionality from birth, right? So I was adopted at birth with my, my race, my ethnicity being Black and Latino, but adopted into a predominantly white environment with a white mom and a Black dad, right? While growing up as a young gay kid in this type of environment, and trying to navigate that has always been challenging as a young person without having the tools and language about, who am I, right? So I really got involved into social justice work as a teenager, and started working at a local nonprofit organization called Smile that focuses on LGBTQ youth in my early 20s. And that's where I really discovered my passion of working particularly with the LGBTQ youth of color population. There's just a whole mosaic of needs that are many times unaddressed and lack of resources available. And I just felt that, it was an opportunity for me to provide that. So I wanted to look at it from a holistic perspective. So I was able to actually work at GW around 10 years ago in the School of Public Health, working on the PrEP clinical trials from a more biomedical perspective. I've done programming with a wide range of different nonprofit organizations focusing on LGBTQ youth from the facilitator perspective and the party perspective. So I ran an organization called Impulse Group DC, which focused on providing elevated experiences and parties for gay and bisexual men, focusing on HIV and STI prevention and treatment education, substance abuse and mental health. And then into the arts, where I began a nonprofit called Breaking Ground that focuses on providing a musical theater production that they curate for LGBTQ youth based off their life stories after going through group level counseling. I completed my master's in mental health and rehabilitation counseling at UDC. And my focus is really around making sure that our population has the access and resources to focusing on their mental health, their physical health, just holistically, the opportunity for equity in our community that many times isn't provided for such a marginalized population. So that's who I am. That's how I got here. And I do want to say just ahead of time, excuse me if my voice is a little raspy. I have a bit of a head cold right now. So if you missed something, just let me know and I'll repeat it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you. And feel better, my brother. Thank you again for joining us, even though you're a little under the weather. First of all, I'll say, wow, the diversity is on display. We have GW employees, GW graduates, the diversity within the LGBT community is on display. I am in awe, as well as immensely proud of each and every one of you, what you are doing and what you will do. And I, Chris, as a graduate of our program, AJ, Eunice, as employees here, just thank you really for, giving back. Really, I don't think if we go any further without just saying thank you, I think we'd be remiss. But it's Pride Month, so I've got a question for you, and it's a little bit of a remix on the questions that I have sent ahead of time. I'm known for doing that, but just bear with me. We'll go in reverse order. So AJ, we'll start with you. What does pride mean to you personally? And what do you think pride should mean within DEI work? So I want to just say for our audience, we have a lot of experience here. We have a center director, we have a program director, we have a DEI director in K through 12 schools, and we all know the craziness that's going on with that right now. So I want to kind of use the breadth and expertise to see if we can get, not just some personal anecdotes, but also, a little bit of critique on the field as well. So what does pride mean to you personally? And what do you think pride should mean within DEI work? The brother AJ King, we'll start with you.
Awesome, thank you. Pride for me means the ability and the access to tap into something within yourself where you feel that you can not only acknowledge, but embrace and love every piece of you, where there's an intersectionality around race, around who you love, around your identity, how you walk through this world. And although the reality is you will get backlash from someone somewhere, still living in confidence around this is who I am, take it or leave it. And, I think that when we come from the conversation around what pride looks like from a more macro level, being able to connect with like-minded individuals who walk through this world different from you, but in the same philosophy of this is who I am and this is who I love. What it needs to look like from a DEI perspective is, I think that there's a lot of conversations around, equality and, treating everyone the same and making sure we all, have equal access. And, that all sounds great, but the reality is that, a lot of times people, businesses, organizations, companies don't want to have the harder conversations around what it looks like around equity and making sure that those who are more marginalized have the access and the resources to make sure that there really is equal opportunity for everyone. And we even talk about it from this, cultural competence lens, right? Being competent in different cultures. Well, that's a textbook, right? I can read about different cultures, but when we talk about cultural humility and being able to understand people from different backgrounds, able to embrace it, able to really not just learn about it, but be it, not be it in the sense of trying to be part of that community necessarily, but be it by loving and supporting and embracing and providing the resources that may not exist within a certain population. And I think that many times that could be missing in the DEI work. I'm really hoping that we can get to a place where we could say, hey, this certain population does have this set of needs that does not exist. And even though we can set things in place and we can set these laws or these rules or, these guidelines around, everyone has access to it, some people cannot reach that access. And so we need to be able to have those hard conversations about who needs that additional help and what does that additional help look like. And that means putting funding towards that. That means being able to have a safe space to have those conversations. It's already hard as a marginalized individual and a marginalized population to speak up to those who are in positions of power, to those who are directors, to those who are deans or provosts or whoever, to say, I need this so that I can succeed, because there's already the perception of, if I speak up at all, that's just going to validate that I'm less than already being part of this community, right? And so I think that we need to be very intentional about providing that safe space where we as a marginalized population can say, this is what I need, and I need help navigating how we can get there.
Thank you. Thank you. Eunice, what does pride mean to you? What do you think pride should mean within the DEI space?
Yeah, I think that for me, pride really means not really needing to ask for permission anymore to exist. I think that queer and trans folks have been like systematically, routinely been forced to disappear ourselves, whether that's through policy, whether it's through policing, et cetera, and even in our educational systems. And so I think it's really a proclamation of the fact that we are here, that we've always been here, and that we are possible. I think in terms of what it can look like in the DEI space, I think that AJ, you touched a lot on kind of being able to balance and really bring together like what are our values, and then what are the actions, and like what are we doing to follow up on these things that we say we believe in. And so I think a lot of that really has to be about accountability. And accountability in the sense that like, well, it's not just, oh, what can everyone else do around me to like be more inclusive and to be more accepting and to really embody our values, but like, what am I doing? What am I practicing in this current moment? And so I think there has to be a lot of truth telling, I think in our spaces right now, and also calling ourselves on our own bluff when we are resistant to, when we're hesitant to, or we're unwilling to take on this work.
Wow, powerful, powerful. I'm going to resist the follow-ups because I do want to save time for our audience Q&A. So I'll go right to Chris. Chris, I'll say you're in a unique position as, you're a DEI director in a K through 12 school. And we have seen, if you've been paying attention, and you might not have, because, there are a lot going on that we want to kind of hold and shield ourselves from here in America. LGBT students have been under attack in K through 12 schools over the last 6 months, over the last couple of years. So, from that perspective, what does pride mean to you? But what should pride mean in the DEI space?
There's a lot to unpack there. And thank you, Dr. Wright, for highlighting the experiences that we're going through right now as K-12 educators. And thank you, Eunz and AJ, for sharing that. I think I'd like to largely reflect solidarity and connection to your definitions of what pride means to myself. I think for me personally, maybe this is an odd position, but I don't really have pride in my like LGBTQ identity. I don't have pride in my non-binary identity. I have strived to have a place of, or be in a place of self-love or self-worth or like acknowledgement, right? And for me, my experience has been not pride about, right? Because I think that like that is sort of in battle with shame. It's more letting go of the ideas that I have sort of inherited or that I've been exposed to about what it means to be queer, about what it means to be different in all shapes and forms, right? And I think that for me, it's come to a place of just rejecting all human hierarchy in all forms, all shapes, in any way that it shows up, and rejecting the ideas that we attach to certain people. And Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist, he talks about sexual racism and sexual genderism, right? Like these ideas that are attached to Black queer, or white straight, right? And I'm really, really interested in that sort of work of like, how do we get rid of, or how do we move away from, or sort of, well, not move away from as in like be blind to it, but be aware of these ideas and actively reduce them or sort of discourage the trafficking of these ideas, right? And so that's where I'm coming from in terms of the personal, right? My personal definition is also political, right? So like I can't have pride in something if I am not doing something to promote access or freedom or the more expansive definition of human experience for my siblings and my brothers and sisters of all generations, right? So I'm rooted in Eugene V. Debs' definition of not rising above people, which is sort of what we talk about in the US. And I rose above poverty, I rose above sexism, I rose above this. And instead, it's rising with people. Okay? So like I strive in my practice, which is rooted in anti-capitalism, rooted in anti-racism, right? And a host of other antis, to rise people with me, right? And so that brings me to the work that I do in terms of with the students. I am hyper aware of the narrative and the backlash and the sort of vitriol that is coming towards people who are practitioners of DEI in the K-12 space, right? So you're exactly right to mention that there's a lot of sensitivity right now with that, and I think that makes sense depending on different angles that you look at, right? Demographic change, economic issues, inflation. You're talking about people's resources, right? You're talking about people's resources with their kids. So that makes sense, right? And how I've worked to try to promote that is centering the voices of the students in everything that I do, right? So I don't do anything unless I center the voices of the students I'm working with, right? So I'm lucky in that in my position, the DEI committee is a group of students who came together before I even showed up at this school. It's also, my role is also an inaugural role. The school is relatively young, it's only 4 years old. It's the downtown school in Seattle, Washington. It's an interesting model. It's a micro school. There's only 150 kids, 15 faculty, right? So it's so very horizontal in that nature, right? So we're already sort of starting off in that positionality. And the students came together and said, we want, after George Floyd's murder, and said we wanted to get involved. And they interviewed me, right? They brought me in, right? And so I have been working to build on what they've already started. And I've created a pretty robust program this year. And one of the opportunities that I do is called the DEI debrief, where I give students the ability during assemblies where we meet together every week. I give them 5 minutes to talk about an issue that is important to them. And one of my leaders talked about the Don't Say Gay bill, right? And anti-trans bills, right? And so he took it upon himself to educate our entire community in his words about what this is, how it's impacting his community, and what students can do, right? And so I coach them on like, okay, what are 3 things that teenagers can actually do to impact change or to sort of raise awareness about this, right? And so I'm teaching students not necessarily to be activists, I'm teaching them to think critically. Right? I see myself as a combination of civic engagement, because we see that has been stripped away from schools. Basic decent human being skills, because during COVID, a lot of them lost those skills in those 2 years, right? We're seeing a lot of those kids struggling with those connections and those abilities. And also getting to them before they have solidified all of the misinformation about different populations that is pervasive on the internet, right? Right, so I see myself as giving them information and also teaching them the skills of how to critically analyze. But the last thing I'll say before I wrap up is, for me, pride and DEI are they come down to 2 things: humanizing and historicizing. I think that's important work. Humanizing other people, understanding their story, understanding their contributions, where they come from, their cultural identities, the complexity and the texture of that experience. Right? Not in a you're better than me or I'm better than you, and we're different, but every human experience is valid and interesting and part of this intricate experience. And the other is historicizing, which is like I said, understanding what's going on. This has happened before, right? So to your point about the, it's interesting being queer in these schools, because right now we're seeing things like stereotypes about queer people and queer educators rising up again, right? And a lot of people thought that was over, right? And people who are not studies of history or not sort of students of history will think that that's impossible. Like, well, we have marriage equality, everything was one. It's like, well, no, this happens again. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, right? So you have to be aware of this, and if you study what happened in the 80s and the 70s, you know that this isn't new. So I think that, like Eunz said, you have to be really, really cognizant and sensitive and intentional about this work, right? And again, my contribution is centering the students on this. That's sort of where I come from in terms of what pride should be and what DI should be.
Mm, I feel like I'm at church. Feel like I'm in a therapist office. I feel like I'm at a lecture. I'm feeling it all right now. I'm feeling it all right now. And each and every one of your answers is inspiring. Folks, I will remind you that in a couple of minutes, we're going to move to audience Q&A. I see a lot of DEI practitioners, a lot of scholars in the room. Feel free to ask your questions and engage with the panelists. And feel free to be critical. As someone often tells me, the tea is hot sometimes, but sometimes it's necessary. So we don't all necessarily need to agree when we come to these conversations. But back to the panel, and we'll start with you, Chris, and go back in reverse order for this next question. And it builds off the last question. So, you know, all three of you are DEI practitioners. From what I heard, at least two of you are in brand new and inaugural positions in which you're sort of, you know, building the ship or building a bridge as you're crossing it, pick your a metaphor. So here's the question. What responsibility do K through 12 schools, do universities, do schools of education, higher education programs have to explicitly create a so-called safe space for LGBTQ students? And when I say LGBTQ, I'm talking about the full gambit of the LGBTQ community. I saw Dr. Kester here earlier, and I think about the work that the special education and disability department has done at gsehd and the intersection between LGBTQ identity and disability. I often think about the work that Ashley Stone did to make our higher education program have a social justice concentration, which we just announced and launched this past Juneteenth. And I see that there are a lot of counseling faculty here, including Dr. Bhagni Das, who's worked on refugee and the sort of intersection between not having a US passport and having LGBT. So, you know, the gambit goes on and on. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, you know, anti-Semitism. And if you don't think that the intersection between anti-Semitism and LGBT identity has a particularly, you know, a fraught history, you haven't read enough. And I've got some classes for you. But, you know, thinking about intersectionality, what role, Chris, if you want to take it with K through 12, AJ, if you want to take it from a center perspective, Eunice, if you want to take it from a program perspective, what role do schools, colleges, universities, P through 16 have in making that university, that classroom, a safe space for LGBT students? Take it as you wish. We'll start with you, Chris.
You can tell that I'm thinking deeply about this. That's a good question, right? I think that it's different for institutions that are sort of private, which is where I work. I work in an independent institution, and they usually have missions, right, which usually articulate their values, right? And for me, my role is actually getting to actually practice that. What does that look like in practice, right? It's all well and lovely that we say that we believe in diversity and respect and consideration and integrity. That's fantastic. What does that look like for an instructor, for a faculty member, for an administrator, for a student leader, right? And so I say that we have a responsibility to make sure that every student feels affirmed in the spaces in which we are expecting them to bring their full self. Right? We say we want them to bring their full selves. We have to make that applicable for them. I don't think that any safe space exists. I don't think any safe space exists in general, right? I do think that we can cultivate a space where people feel comfortable being vulnerable or more vulnerable than they would be in other settings, or more brave than they would be in other settings, right? And so I think about the fact that if a space is safe for everybody, somebody's lying, right? Somebody's usually lying, right? In terms of like not bringing their full self, right? Because human beings are intricately more diverse and different. I focus on creating affirming practices for everyone, right? Not just students, not also parents and guardians, their siblings, family members, faculty, administrators. You know, one of which is, you know, asking students what their pronouns are. Right? So like, now there's International, you know, Pronoun Day. Ask students to, if they feel comfortable, share their pronouns with you so that you can make sure that you are affirming them and that you're not misgendering them at all times, right? making it clear what the protocol is or what the practice or expectation is when misgendering is one thing. We were just talking about accountability. I've learned to sort of soften things a little bit. So I tell people, I'm holding you capable. I'm holding you capable of living within our values in our community. And so that is sort of the angle that I sort of bring to this, right? You have to be a little bit more diplomatic in terms of the babies, right? But also, I feel like we have a responsibility to create gender and LGBTQ plus affirming practices, policies, and programs, because all of our students are more diverse than we could ever imagine. Right? So Gen Z, especially coming up, and then and Alpha, which is after them, are the most LGBTQ plus identifying students that we ever had in the US that we know of, right? It's also the most racially diverse, right? It's also the most neurodiverse, right? So we have all of these different intersecting identities that, if you focus on a school being or a space being neurodiverse friendly, whatever that means, or affirming in terms of their race, you don't focus on LGBTQ, you're always going to be missing a component, right? And people talk about, I'm Black first or I'm queer first. That I reject that completely. I'm me first. I can't take my LGBTQ identity or my Black identity or my neurodiversity away from a space. People feel that, or they see it, or they know it, when they connect with me. And so I think that it's hard to think about how to do this work well if you're not centering, again, you're centering the voice of the students, asking them what they need and actually listening, right? And to your point about how hard it is in different spaces, mostly it's hard because people have ideas about these communities that have been baked in, right? One is that trans kids are just, so sensitive, right? And they're so triggered and they're so snowflakey. No, they're not triggered and snowflakey. They're used to being disaffirmed in every single space that you come to, and that hurts, right? And so you have to be willing to engage in trust building and ask them how you can do that. Right? It's a part of it being a leader is, and I create a resource for myself this year after learning some lessons with the students, is communication strategies with students, right? Simple things like if you're meeting in the office, asking them, do they feel comfortable with the door open or closed? Asking them if they know that you're a mandated reporter, in terms and educating them about what that is. When they finish talking, asking them to repeat back to you in their own words what their understanding is, so you can sort of clear up some things. Are simple ways to sort of tell students and show them that you respect their agency and you are giving them the opportunity to think about these things and to offer up their wisdom, right? And so for queer people and people who are trans and people who are part of that experience, who are used to our ways of not being affirmed or being asked, things being, cis heteronormativity and being imposed on us, even small things that demonstrate that we're learning with you and I'm not teaching you, can I think invite students to engage in trust, and they will talk about themselves more and share more, and that'll give you the opportunity to actually think proactively about providing more resources.
I'm taking notes. Okay, Eunice, why don't you go next? And to just remind you, the question is, what responsibility do schools, K through 12 schools, colleges, and universities have for ensuring that the classroom, the co-curricular environment is a safe space for LGBTQ students?
Yeah, definitely. I think as Chris was talking about, this notion of safety, I mean, in my personal opinion, like there really is no such thing as a safe space, because spaces are dynamic and people can move and shift and add different layers to them that, for one person could feel safe, for another person may not be safe at all. So I think, first of all, really trying to, reframe our thinking around like what spaces look like and how we allow them to shift and evolve, and how we adapt them to the needs of the people that are currently, in that space. I think next, And I want to draw a little bit on the knowledge of a non-binary writer, an activist that I really love. Their name is Alok Vaid Menon. Some of you might be familiar with their book, Beyond the Gender Binary, which if you haven't had a chance to read it, like very much plugging it. But in one of their talks, they explain how we really need to be honest about making sure that there's a clear distinction between comprehension and compassion. And that a lot of the times I think we're under the impression that we need to fully understand who somebody is and their lived experiences in order to believe that they shouldn't be subject to violence, or they shouldn't be spat on, or they shouldn't, experience like blatant hatred, transphobia, etc., transmisogyny, you name it. When really, I think like there's a very clear level of empathy that we can offer folks. And I think to some of your points, Chris, too, about like being able to grow with one another. And what does that really look like in practice? So I think it's about being able to discern between those things, because I think sometimes when we say, oh, I don't know enough about this topic, like I'm not equipped to to be able to discuss this or to truly engage with it, which I think in some areas is valid. I think that folks should be able to come in and provide informed information, especially to other folks who are still learning. But I think that sometimes it's a little bit of a cop-out, because, if you think that you don't have a responsibility necessarily to be able to explore these issues and to provide opportunities to engage with folks on them in a way that's like really meaningful, then like, what does that say about what you really care about? We find time for the things that we're really passionate about, but when it comes to, trans people, queer people, gender nonconforming people, non-binary people, it's like, there's a lot of things to, learn there. I think I'm going to leave that to somebody else, you know what I mean? And I think to kind of expand more on like what our responsibility is as educators and for folks who are doing this work, I think really being able to show care and even admit sometimes that our educational environments have historically and currently are exposing students and in some ways subjecting them to a lot of harm. One of my friends actually works in the public school system, teaches 9th grade, I believe, and is always sharing with me, we have these ongoing reflections together about how a student will be experiencing, a lot of anxiety in the classroom, and the immediate response to that is to be punitive or, to want to take them out of the space. And so I think when we think about how to create more gender inclusive, more identity affirming spaces, I think it's also about being really honest about the ways that spaces have harmed folks. And I think being able to strategize together and get creative about, are we reproducing things that say we're against? Whether it's the carceral system, whether it's like punishing students for having emotions, for experiencing grief. I think right now, a lot of our students are just being subjected to continue to keep moving as if, we didn't have multiple mass shootings within the last like month alone, as if we don't currently have, as of what I know, we've had over 240 anti-LGBTQ bills just in like January 2022 to now, and what that kind of effect is, what that effect has on them. And so I think, how are we modeling what it looks like to allow our students to grieve, to take space and time to just be, and to really center what it is they need in a moment, because they're having to process and go through a lot. So yeah, I think at the real human core, there needs to be a lot of, I think, just rethinking about what our priorities really are and what's important right now.
Oh, no, so true, so true. And thank you. I think that, you put a lot on there, and hopefully we can unpack some of that in the Q&A. AJ, why don't you wrap us up on this question? And just to remind you what we're talking about, what responsibility do K through 12 schools, college, universities have to make sure that the classroom, the co-curricular environment, the places that students learn, live, and play are safe spaces, if you want to use that term, for LGBTQ students. What are your thoughts?
So I think about young people today, and I honestly don't know how they do it. And what I mean by that is, back when I was in middle school and high school, if there was someone who was out absolutely at a different time, we dealt with bullying, we dealt with, parents who did not accept us, we maybe get kicked out of our homes, we couldn't dress certain ways. Sure, all those things existed, right? And now in 2022, we're in the future now, right? All those things still exist. Plus, they turn on the TV or open up their social media and they're being told that they can't even say the word gay. They're being told that if you're trans identified, that there's something wrong with you and we're going to come after your parents. They're being told, and you, right? They're being told that, no, you're not going to be able to use this bathroom. At least before, it's for the most part stayed at a interpersonal level where there was a glimmer of hope of when I become an adult, it'll get better. And now they get so much exposure to, oh, wait, okay, this is from a political lens that I'm not seeing, right? And it's on top of dealing with mass school shootings, on top of dealing with a pandemic, on top of dealing with just being a teenager, right? 8 homework assignments from different classes, first loves and relationships, dealing with puberty, just teen angst, right? Your parents in control, all that coming with the person who's 16 years old, throw in if they're a person of color, right? There's so much going on. The pressures through social media of how to look and how your body should be, and just so much. So, I think that at the end of the day, that representation piece is going to be critical, but it needs to be in their face. So when they're taking those sex education courses in school, what does it look like for same-sex individuals or those who are non-binary, trans-identified, to know their bodies, to know what sex between 2 men looks like or 2 women looks like, right? What does it look like as far as policies in the locker room at gyms? And if you have to wear uniforms, making sure that there's inclusivity around that as well too. And we're just talking about from the K through 12 level at this point, right? And, so I think that we also have to know that they are stepping into a space when they do graduate where it will get better. So, we were very intentional at the Multicultural Student Service Center. We're currently restructuring the LGBTQ Resource Center to have that representation from an intersectional perspective. So when you first walk in down the hallway, we have every flag you can imagine. The baseline, LGBT flag, with the trans inclusivity and the brown and black. Then we have non-binary flag. We have the trans pride flag. We have the lesbian flag. We have the pansexual flag. We have the asexual flag. So all the flags just when you first walk into the hallway, right? Then we have a lounge where there's a representation of young people, their age, in the media who are LGBTQ identified. We have a poster of Lil Nas X, of Ricky Martin, of Janelle Monáe, young people that they can connect to, right? And just hang out and just be them, free of schools and studying, just live and be yourself. And then we have a resource center side that has that representation that's showing intersectionality racially and gender. We have, Gladys Bentley, we have Bayard Rustin, we have James Baldwin, we have all that representation in their face so that they can see themselves or who they hope to be, because they have to know that it may be mess right now. It may not feel so good right now when you go home and visit your family, or, when you go into the locker room or when you step into that classroom, but you are seen. There are people who will see you, and you can be the person that people can look at and be seen by, right? And so we also wanted to be very intentional of looking at diversity from perspective that impacts our community. So, the CDC data says that, 1 in 2, 50% of Black men who have sex with men are going to test positive for HIV. 1 in 4 Latinx men who have sex with men will test positive for HIV, right? So the reality is those living with HIV is major in our community. So we want to be intentional about having free and confidential HIV testing in our space as well too, where not only do you not have to pay or have insurance, but you actually get an incentive for testing, right? We want to have access in our bathrooms to free condoms and lubrication and tampons and pads and, you know, and binders. And we want to make sure that all these things are there, not because you have to ask for them, but just because they're there and it's normalized. So we just have to be very intentional of just having things present in your face and accessible if and whenever you need it.
Preach, brother, preach. Preach, brother, preach. So folks, as we're coming up on the 1 o'clock hour, we have one more question before we go to the Q&A. I will remind you that you can put questions in the chat or in the Q&A function, just in case you do have to dip off at 1 p.m. But we'll try to get the one more question in, and then we'll stop the recording. We'll move to a format where we can all see each other, and then we'll try to have a conversation for the last 15 minutes or so. But for this last question, Eunice, I'm going to start with you, and then AJ, I'll go to you, and we'll finish with you, Chris. And it's about allies, right? And, you know, you wouldn't have a gsehd diversity event if you didn't have at least one controversial question. So let me not disappoint the people. What is an ally in 2022? As LGBTQ folks, and I may even go as far as to say LGBTQ folks of color, because that's what we all are right now, do we still need allies? Is the concept of an ally still something that should be in there? You know, I often think of Stonewall was a riot, you understand? But in one of the first major movies produced by Hollywood about Stonewall, didn't feature Marsha P. Johnson, didn't feature Sylvia Rivera. It featured some white blonde man throwing a rock, right? And that's just not real history. No offense to white men. There, you know, by many white men have helped me within my life, some homosexual, some not. But, you know, the concept of an ally in 2022 is a fraught one, right? Because there are many allies that within their allyship have gotten the better of that relationship, right? And this goes to, of course, the concept of intersectionality that comes from Kimberly Crenshaw and Black feminism. Shout out to Dr. Jordan West and her class. But Eunice, let me just start with you, and you can take it however you wish. What is an ally? Do you think that we still need the concept of allies? If there's someone on this call, like I am not part of the LGBT community, but I'm here at Dr. Wright to support, how can I be a better ally? What would be your advice to them?
Really good question. It's actually very interesting because I was just talking with my supervisor, Dr. Jordan West, about this in a previous meeting we had together about allyship and like really interrogating like, well, why do people use the word ally? What does it really mean? Like, is it something that you assign to yourself? Is it something that other people label you as, etc.? And I think we're way beyond that idea of the quote unquote conventional ally. I think we need something more. Like one of the words that we talked about, or one of the concepts was about being a co-conspirator, somebody who's, you know, very devoted, not only to your liberation, but also because your liberation is tied to theirs. And so to quote Alok again, there was this interview that they did about masculinity, etc., talking about the gender binary, and the interviewer goes, well, how do I help you get free? And they basically respond and say, actually, like, I don't need help. Like, what I need right now is for you to ask yourself, like, how do I free myself? Because I think in that same vein, like, queer and trans people, like, we are proving with our existence, with the ways that we show up every day, with our, you know, with the ways that we live unapologetically every day, like, we don't have anything to prove. But what we're asking for folks is, you know, are you ready to heal yourself? Like, are you ready to reject these systems, these conditions that are also harming you? And I think only in that, when you realize that, like, this, as much as it affects me, actually affects you. Like, I'm here because I see a limitless possibility of the types of people that we can be. I think trans people, like, we model every day by being alive that there are infinite ways to be. And I think there's this misconception that we don't need, like, that we don't want people to identify as a man or don't want people to identify as a woman. But really what we're saying is, like, you, as many people as there are in this world, there's many ways to experience being a man, being a woman, etc., and everybody else in between. And so I think when we think about being co-conspirators, I think there first has to be this investment into this idea and practice that our liberations are tied together. And that's why we want to do this work. And that's why it's important.
Got the, I'm not going to clap. You got the, thunderclaps and the clicks. That was a real powerful answer. Real powerful answer. AJ, why don't we go with you? Same question. Building on the answers that have already been given, but of course, we're interested in your personal opinion. What is an ally? How can one be an ally? Do we still need the concept of allies in 2022?
The word that comes to mind is self-awareness. And the reason why I say that is because, there are two things that come to mind that I've seen that looks like allyship, which is not allyship. And that's tokenization, and that is appropriation. And so what I mean by that is, I will, for example, the ballroom culture, that's something that, is inherently of the Black and Latin LGBT experience. It stems back to the 60s and 70s, right? And then it became commercialized with these breakthrough, amazing shows like Pose, right? And now it became so commercialized where our language and the way that we walk and the way that we talk has been so blackfaced in a way, like so taken and made fun of. And I'm seeing, it's funny, I was talking with my supervisor, Mr. Topscott, about this the other day as well too. How in society we'll see like straight Black men saying, the tea is right, well, they threw shade at so and so. That's our cultural language, what I'm saying, that we were getting jumped for 20 years ago if we said that. And now it's become so appropriated and normalized. And, I'll walk into a gay bar, where I can be in a space around my people, and it is nothing but heterosexual women celebrating their bachelorette party, and they taking over the entire space, right? And so now this space isn't for us anymore. And so that's what I mean by that appropriation piece, and that people got to be careful for. And then the tokenization piece, I remember I was working at this one organization, and they were, they were doing something around Pride, the first time they wanted to do something around Pride. And they had this optional committee of staff who wanted to be part of that. My plate was completely full. I could not be part of it. Because I did not participate in that, mind you, they were emailing me nonstop because I was the only LGBT identified individual on staff. There was an expectation that I had to be part of this. And because I chose not to, I was then questioned by one of the staff around my dedication toward the LGBTQ community. Now, let's turn that conversation around if it was Black History Month, if I was the only Black person on staff and I could not participate in that, and then a white staff person questioned me about how I feel about my Blackness. Out of control, right? And so that tokenization and that appropriation piece show up as a result of allyship. And so that's why I want to say that self-awareness of what it means to be an ally without conditions, without a, hey, I'm cool with you, dude, being gay, just don't hit on me. I'm cool with you as a trans-identified person, but I'm not changing the way that I identify you with your pronouns. That's not allyship. That is an individual deciding with conditions how they are going to move forward with you without seeing the full you. Allyship to me is walking through the world with who I am, what I bring authentically, 100%. And the self-awareness of the space that they take in the safe spaces that we have for ourselves.
Powerful words, powerful words. Chris, why don't you bring us home? What do you think about this? Anything to add about the concept of allies? Do we need allies? And as soon as we're done with Chris's answer, we're going to go to audience Q&A.
I know that we're running a little bit out of time, so I'll try to be brief here, famous last words. I think that ally, to what AJ and Eunz were talking about, ally is somebody who centers themselves in the struggle, right? So we talk about, and we've talked about this in graduate school in gsehd, interest convergence theory, right? So like, I'm only going to show up when and if it is advantageous to me to be here. And when the winds change, I am immediately going to step back and like be nowhere to be found, right? And so I want to plug Dr. Liza Telesan's book, The Identity Conscious Educator, which is phenomenal read. And she writes in her book about the transition from being an ally to an abolitionist, right? And because I am a child of pop culture, I am going to use some pop culture references here, right? So I think about like most recently the furor and and sort of the controversy with Kendrick Lamar's like Anti-Diaries, right? Like him talking about his experience with a trans members of his community, of his family, and like understanding their transness and their identity, and like him understanding where they stood with that, right? And the humanization process of like validating their experiences, right? That for me is more on the abolitionist end of the spectrum, because he's doing something not with queer people or like on behalf of queer people, but with him and with other straight, presumably Black and or white men, because white men are actually the biggest consumers of rap culture, right? But like white and Black men, right? Saying, hey, this is what transness is. Let's honor their experience. They told us this is what they want. Let's make sure we're doing that, right? And like, it wasn't perfect. It was messy. There were some words that he used that he should not have used, right? And I'm still giving him credit because he's on the process of becoming more aware and doing the introspection and the reflection about that, right? So abolitionists are people who I think see how things work, see the disparate outcomes that come from these ideas, right? And the policies and the ways things have been, and are willing to put up something, whether it's social status, economic wealth, resources, opportunities, sexual partners, what have you, right? To say, I'm going to give up something, or I'm going to risk something because I believe in these values, right? I think that is somebody who's abolitionist, right? To Eunz's point, right? I always ask myself when I see someone like, why are you here? Most fundamentally, like, why are you here, right? Like if you're not here to actually make sure that you're getting free, like, thank you so much. This has been cute, right? I'll see you at the next potluck or not. I know that they're not actually committed to this work, right? And I know this just from my own practice of going to school and taking classes with Asian American studies, and learning about going to mosques and going to synagogues and learning about their different histories and cultures, not because I want to quote unquote get brownie points for being woke, but because I know that like these people are facing oppression in a slightly different way, but in the same sort of direction that I'm facing. And me understanding how they attack these people will help me to better understand how I am being attacked. And it can help us both create coalitions and structures that will prevent us, or at least challenge our oppression, right? And so I think that allies are fine for like the first 3 seconds or so. Like it's nice, that's cute, it's a jumping off point. Don't stay there, keep it pushing, right? So allies, I understand you may be racist, and then like you're transitioning to anti-racism. Allyship is that first step. We're trying to get to abolition, sort of the goal.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for that. We're going to stop the recording.